welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are walking right into a really interesting community space. It's a place defined by its commitment where kindness seems to be everywhere.
Absolutely. But there's a question hiding underneath that kindness, isn't there? An ethical one.
That's what we're digging into.
Yeah.
We start with this incredibly vivid picture from our sources. Imagine a small American town,
Yeah. And get this. 5 different churches.
just lining 2 main streets, shoulder to shoulder almost,
And the bells, apparently they echo daily. It's like the soundtrack of the town.
setting the whole rhythm of life there.
It really is. It's more than just, a location. It's described as an ecosystem. Our source material, it's drawn heavily from the observations of a doctoral student.
Right, someone looking closely from the inside, but also slightly from the outside.
Exactly. And they paint this picture of really intense, supportive warmth. It's palpable. You see these constant, visible acts of service, rotating charity drives, for instance.
Okay.
Distributing food, clothing, supplies for children. They organize communal dinners.
So real community life, very active.
Very active, yeah. The definition of a thriving, supportive community focused on, neighborly care.
And yet,
Yeah.
right there, in the middle of all that visible warmth, the observer brings up this hidden tension. It's a question that people new to this environment, maybe seekers, feel really acutely.
And it's a big one.
Yeah, it's straightforward on the surface, but the implications are huge. Is the love they're showing, is it really unconditional?
And this phrase from the source is just so powerful. Is it a gentle bind?
Wow. Yeah, gentle bind. That really captures the unease, doesn't it?
It does, because that's the central conflict we're diving into today. It's about freedom versus expectation. When faith is woven so deeply, and you have to say so successfully, into the everyday fabric of life.
When the charity and the connection are just inseparable.
Right. The person looking for answers, the seeker, they're left wondering, okay, where does the genuine, selfless human kindness end? And where does the sort of required expectation of spiritual conformity begin?
Okay, let's really try to unpack this. Our mission today, it's sort of threefold. First, we'll dig into the detailed observations of this specific religious ecosystem. Really focus on the mechanics of that gentle embrace.
How it works on the ground.
Exactly. Second, we'll explore the philosophical questions it raises, this challenge to the whole idea of standard answers in life.
Which is a really profound critique.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And finally, we'll look at the theological response. How does Christianity address these fears? The argument for grace, for trust, even when things are uncertain.
Sounds like a plan. It's a complex dynamic.
Okay, so let's start with that doctoral student's perspective. Studying in the U.S., taking meticulous notes, this is our main lens.
Right. And the first thing to really let sink in is that local reality. 5 churches, 2 main streets.
That density. It's kind of staggering when you think about it.
It really is. It speaks volumes about how deeply saturated the spiritual message is in the town's identity. Historically, culturally, it means there's almost no truly secular public space for this student to just be.
Every block feels kind of claimed, in a way.
Effectively, yeah. Hallowed ground, owned by one denomination or another. It sets a very specific tone.
And that sets the stage perfectly for what the sources call the twin vines.
Yes, the twin vines. This is maybe the most critical early observation the student makes.
It suggests that charity and evangelism aren't like separate activities the churches do.
No, not at all. They're described as growing intertwined, like actual vines. You can't really separate them without damaging the whole plant, the whole system.
So the charity part, the food, the help, that's the root system.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It provides the nourishment, the stability for the community. It builds trust, solves immediate real-world problems.
Makes sense. People respond to that.
Of course. But this tangible worldly help is immediately and very deliberately tied to the missionary work, or as the source later calls it, a new round of inheritance.
Inheritance.
Yes.
Interesting term.
Isn't it? So the community connects through genuine physical care, but that care simultaneously functions as the main vehicle for outreach, for proselytizing.
Okay, so we see how these vines grow together in this very specific, almost ritualized way, the student describes. They talk about these interactions, particularly with elderly men distributing pamphlets, often near campus or community hubs.
Yes, and the description of these men is key. Ironed shirts and carefully practiced smiles.
Let's pause on that phrase. Carefully practiced smiles. What does that suggest to you?
It suggests intention, right? Strategy. It's not just spontaneous warmth. It's warmth deployed for a purpose.
Designed to achieve a specific emotional response. maybe lower defenses.
I think that's exactly it. The careful management of emotion is crucial to this gentle bind idea. These men have to strike a balance. They can't be overly enthusiastic. That might scare people off.
Right, not too pushy.
But they can't be cold or bureaucratic either. They need to seem approachable, kind, genuinely caring.
While still staying focused on the mission.
Precisely. Maintaining that disciplined focus.
And the actual conversation, the sequence of it, is described as almost mechanical in its subtlety anyway.
Yeah, there's a pattern. It starts super casual.
Like asking about your studies, where you're from, the weather.
Yeah.
Just small talk.
Building that quick, low-stakes human connection. Making you feel seen for a moment.
And then pretty quickly, it shifts.
It does. It transitions into this warm, immediate invitation, usually to dinner at an American home.
Ah, the dinner invitation. That feels significant.
It's the linchpin, according to the student's analysis. It's an act of profound hospitality, especially for, say, an international student.
Someone far from home, maybe lonely, definitely navigating a new culture.
Exactly. That warmth, that offer of a home-cooked meal, connection. It's a powerful magnet and meets a real need.
And it creates a sense of, well, obligation, or at least gratitude.
Definitely gratitude, maybe a touch of social indebtedness. You've accepted this kindness. And it's only after the guest has accepted the food, the shelter, the company, the warmth.
After they're sort of in.
Yes. Only then do the hosts move on to what the student calls a new round of inheritance.
The proselytizing itself.
Right. But again, it's woven in.
How so? What does that look like?
It's not usually a hard sell, not a big dramatic conversion pitch. It's more environmental, ambient, like hand-holding and prayer before meals might just be presented as the norm. Participation is expected, assumed.
So you just kind of go along with it.
You often do, and phrases like, God loves you or God will bless you are repeated frequently. It creates this atmosphere of comfort, but maybe also a subtle kind of surveillance, like your spiritual state is always implicitly on the table.
Interesting. And the promotion of other activities.
Bible studies, group fellowships, that's described as pervasive.
Pervasive. Not aggressive, but just everywhere.
Exactly. It's not a forceful push. It's a gentle, constant, almost inescapable immersion into that world.
Okay, this leads us right into the analysis of how this whole thing works, the operating logic. The student calls it cunning.
Cunning, yes. And the perceived cunning lies in its indirectness. It's effective because it works by subversion rather than confrontation. Meaning, this system doesn't operate by forbidding things, like some older religious models might. It's not about harsh rules or denying worldly pleasures.
Okay.
Instead, it operates by offering something, an alternative that seems warmer, safer, better.
And it doesn't operate by demanding obedience or, oppressing individuality in an obvious way.
Right. It works by inviting you to dinner, inviting you into the community.
And by comforting, offering these immediate, accessible answers to life's big, scary questions and fears.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core of the analysis, moving from just observing to understanding the psychological impact.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
The system seems designed, or at least functions, to provide what the source calls a carefully crafted sense of contentment.
Contentment, that sounds nice.
It does. It offers these standard answers to existential pain, to confusion, to anxiety.
Got it. So it targets people who are maybe struggling, weary souls, as the source puts it.
Right. Precisely. People dealing with genuine life difficulties. And it offers this sweet bait: security, certainty, belonging.
And it replaces maybe the older models of external coercion, like fear of punishment.
With this internal emotional satisfaction you get from fitting in, from conforming, from feeling cared for.
Okay, but the student identifies a hidden cost here. A big one.
A huge one. And this hits right at the values of many listeners. I think people who value knowledge, curiosity, independent thought.
What's the trade-off?
The student characterizes it as trading that worldly warmth, that emotional security, for the surrender of freedom of thought.
Freedom of thought. Wow, okay, unpack that.
The system encourages reliance on these easy, standard answers. God has a plan, everything happens for a reason.
Comforting phrases for sure.
Absolutely. But they function, according to this critique, to dissolve life's inherent complexity, to smooth over the messy, difficult parts. If God has a detailed plan for you, maybe you don't need to wrestle so hard to figure out your own path, your own meaning.
It makes the struggle seem unnecessary, or even like a lack of faith.
Potentially, yes. It offers the comfort of religious certainty, but at the potential expense of authentic intellectual and existential wrestling.
There's this great metaphor the student uses about mailboxes.
Oh, right. That perfectly illustrates how the invitation starts to feel like constraint. The student notes once you've gone to one event, maybe that dinner.
Your mailbox starts filling up.
Exactly. Notifications for Bible study Tuesday, fellowship Thursday, worship Saturday and Sunday. It becomes constant.
The physical paper might say it's filled with concern for you.
But the student's final analysis is sharp. They say these notifications feel like gentle ropes.
Gentle ropes.
Gradually weaving into a web.
That's chilling. A web spun from goodwill.
Let's think about that psychological impact for a second. Why are the ropes gentle?
Because they're made of kindness, social inclusion, the things you initially wanted.
Precisely. They're spun from goodwill. But the student feels a debt is being created. A real, though unspoken, debt. The moment someone accepts ongoing support, the free meals, the rides, the companionship, the emotional comfort.
They're implicitly buying into the system that provides it.
That's the argument. They're implicitly consenting, perhaps, to the ideological structure that comes with it, the one that ultimately expects conformity.
And then it becomes really hard to say no.
Almost impossible, yeah. How do you refuse the invitation to Bible study without also feeling like you're rejecting the person who gave you dinner?
Like you're ungrateful. Or worse, like you're severing the connection that you've come to rely on.
You'd be ripping the whole web apart, potentially isolating yourself again.
That's a really powerful observation about social leverage. Using kindness as a tool.
And it's important to stress, the critique isn't saying the charity doesn't work. The food gets eaten, the lonely feel less lonely. The charity is effective on that level.
But the critique is about the purity of the motive.
Exactly. Is the motive pure altruism, or is it inextricably tied to the missionary goal, making the very act of receiving help inherently complicated, loaded even?
Okay, so moving from those on-the-ground observations to the student's deeper ethical thinking, we hit that core question again, the one driving their whole internal conflict.
Is this love conditional? That's the anchor, isn't it? The ethical heart of the whole piece.
And it feels like such a valid question in that context.
Absolutely. If the kindness, the time, the attention, the resources are consistently deployed as vehicles for proselytizing,
Then the generosity itself starts to feel suspect. Tainted, maybe.
Does it lose its purity? That's the word the source uses. Does it become essentially an exchange of values?
An exchange, meaning I give you material or emotional support.
And in return, I expect spiritual consideration, or at the very least, your continued participation in the system that offers the support.
Yeah, okay. The concern is that the love being shown isn't inherent, it's premised on something.
Premised on the individual's potential. Their potential to convert, or at least remain open to the message. Tacitly or eventually accepting the religious framework.
And the student runs this kind of mental test.
Yes, a critical thought experiment. Would the concern still be there? Would the dinner invitations keep coming? Would the smiles still be warm if that individual clearly stated, "Thanks for the help, but I'm not interested in the faith aspect"?
If they definitively separated themselves from the religious system.
Right. The student is grappling with the possibility that their social value in this community might be tied more to their spiritual potential than to their intrinsic worth as a human being.
That's a heavy thought.
It is.
But let me push back slightly here, maybe play devil's advocate from the community's view.
Please do.
Isn't almost all human interaction transactional on some level? If I support a local theater, I expect good plays. If a secular charity helps me, they might ask for a donation later to keep their work going. Isn't that also an exchange? Why is the spiritual component uniquely suspicious here?
That's a really fair challenge. And I think the student's critique hinges on the implicit nature of this specific spiritual exchange.
Implicit versus explicit.
Yeah. It masquerades as unconditional love and charity. When a secular NGO asks for a donation, the transaction is usually transparent. Support our work so we can continue the service.
Okay, the terms are clear.
Here, the student perceives the exchange as deliberately hidden, or at least obscured by the language of pure grace and welcome. The material aid is upfront, immediate, but the expected return, the potential surrender of intellectual autonomy, the openness to conformity that's the cost the individual might not even realize they're incurring until they feel those gentle ropes tightening.
Until it feels awkward to say no.
Exactly. And that hesitation the author mentions, that they dare not ask the question about conditionality out loud.
That tells you a lot?
It reveals just how sensitive they are to this hidden condition. They're afraid to confirm the transactional nature they suspect, maybe because that would shatter the warmth they genuinely need or appreciate. It would make the kindness feel calculated.
Which would be disillusioning, to say the least.
Deeply. And this philosophical friction, this suspicion about conditionality, it leads the student naturally into a broader rejection of what they call standard answers.
Standard answers, meaning neat religious explanations for everything.
Pretty much, yeah. They see this particular religious system as trying to dissolve life's profound, beautiful, sometimes painful complexity with the easy comfort of certainty.
The belief system offers this illusion that there's always a permanent answer readily available.
Right. God's blessing is assured. There's a predetermined path for you, a guaranteed place for your soul. It smooths over the pain, the confusion.
But the student argues it also smooths over something necessary.
Yes. It smooths over the necessity of wrestling with reality in all its messiness. The struggle itself is valuable.
Okay, so what do they advocate for instead?
Something much harder, but ultimately, in their view, richer. They call it a life that is nearly imperfect but infinitely real.
Nearly imperfect. Infinitely real. I like that.
Me too. It's about championing the full spectrum of human experience. Pain, confusion, anxiety. These aren't bugs in the system to be eliminated by faith.
They're features.
They're essential components of a vital, authentic existence in this view. You have to embrace them.
This embrace of complexity over comfort, it feels very contemporary, philosophically.
It resonates with a lot of modern thought, yes. The student insists that this real life must also hold space for freedom, for creativity, and crucially, for chance, for randomness.
Because if everything is certain, if every outcome is preordained or explainable by a simple formula,
where's the room for genuine surprise, for real human agency, for creative self-determination? Does choice even matter then?
it becomes a kind of paint-by-numbers life.
That's a good analogy. The student seems to be making this defiant stand for intellectual vitality, for the sometimes painful thrill of discovery over the comfort of emotional security blanket.
They see the spiritual system as practiced in this town, as offering a kind of palliative care for existential angst.
Exactly. A pain reliever, but one that comes at the cost of authentic self-discovery and intellectual honesty.
And they land on this conclusion.
That uncertainty and possibility are the only unchanging truths in the world.
That's a bold statement.
It is. And it implies that any system, whether it's religious, political, philosophical, that tries to eliminate that fundamental uncertainty, that tries to provide all the answers, is ultimately denying reality and potentially hindering true intellectual freedom.
Okay, so let's synthesize this critique before we move to the response. The core challenge isn't necessarily aimed at God or even the act of faith itself in the abstract.
No, it seems much more focused.
It's aimed squarely at the implicit ideological constraints that are cloaked in gentleness.
That's a perfect summary. It's an indictment of this specific model observed in the small town, offering sweet comfort, providing real help, yes, but subtly encouraging weary or vulnerable souls to trade the necessary, difficult, but ultimately liberating struggle of free thought for easy, prepackaged certainty.
It's a powerful critique, and it raises that crucial question.
How does Christian theology itself, the very system being critiqued through this local expression, actually respond to these legitimate, deeply felt doubts about conditional love and forced certainty?
All right, so now we pivot. If the critique is centered on conditional love and cheap certainty, what's the theological counter-argument presented in the sources?
Well, the response has to tackle that perception head-on, right? The idea that kindness or even salvation depends on the person accepting the faith. It needs to address that exchange of values concern directly.
So where does it start?
It goes straight to the biblical core. The argument is that, theologically speaking, God's love is fundamentally not transactional. It's not something you earn through good deeds or giving money or even by having the right emotional response or intellectual assent.
It's presented as what, a gift.
Exactly. A pure unilateral act of grace. The theology itself, in its foundational structure, actually preempts the kind of transactional fear the student described.
Okay, the original script mentioned John 3.16 and Romans 3.24. Let's dig a bit deeper than just quoting them. How do those verses dismantle conditionality?
Good question. The emphasis in both is entirely on God's action coming first, underwriting everything else. John 3.16, for God so loved the world that he gave.
Okay.
The giving precedes any human response. It initiates.
God acts first.
But Romans 3.24, that's where the theological mechanics get really clear, especially for this argument. Paul says believers are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus.
Justified freely. What does justified mean here, theologically?
It means being declared righteous or put right in a relationship with God. And the word freely, Dorian in Greek, is crucial. It means as a gift without cause, undeservedly. This underpins the Reformation concept of sola gratia, grace alone. It introduces the idea of imputed righteousness.
Imputed meaning.
Meaning, righteousness isn't achieved by the person's performance or inherent goodness. It's credited to them, gifted to them because of Christ's action, received through faith, which itself is often seen as a gift. It's entirely external to the individual's merit.
So if salvation itself, the core relationship with God, is a completely free gift,
Right.
then it logically cannot require behavioral compliance or intellectual conformity as a prerequisite to receiving that foundational love or acceptance.
Exactly. Which means the system observed in the small town where kindness seems implicitly conditional on spiritual openness or participation is, from this theological standpoint, a human distortion.
A misunderstanding or misapplication of the core doctrine.
Precisely. It confuses human actions, which can be flawed and transactional, with divine grace, which is defined as unconditional.
The source also gives a concrete biblical example, which is often more persuasive than abstract theology.
Yes, the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, it's powerful in this context.
Why her specifically?
Because she was a complete outsider on multiple levels. A Samaritan, viewed with hostility by Jews, a woman with a complex marital history, likely ostracized within her own community.
Yeah.
Socially and religiously marginalized.
And
Jesus initiates the conversation, crosses multiple social boundaries to do so, and he offers her living water, a metaphor for spiritual life and satisfaction, before she shows any sign of religious conformity, repentance, or even fully understanding who he is.
the offer comes first, unconditionally.
Unconditionally. It's presented as a pure gift. So the argument is that's the model for true Christian love, defined as grace. It must operate outside the human economy of quid pro quo, of earning favor, of expected reciprocation.
Okay, so what's really fascinating here then is this attempt to draw a sharp line
A line between what?
between the potentially flawed transactional reality of how humans practice charity and outreach, like the gentle snare approach in the town, which might indeed be manipulative or misguided.
And God's love itself, as defined theologically, which is presented as inherently divine, pure, and absolutely unconditional.
So, the critique of the town's method might still stand, but the theology claims to offer the antidote within its own framework.
That's a very good way of putting it. The theology itself critiques the flawed human execution.
Okay, let's move to the second major critique, that rejection of cheap certainty. The student rightly pushed back against religion just providing neat, tidy answers for everything.
Yes, they valued the complexity, the imperfection.
How does the theological response handle that? Does it just double down on certainty?
Actually, no. And this is crucial. The response presented doesn't deny the complexity or the discomfort of uncertainty. Instead, it argues that seeking cheap certainty, demanding easy answers for everything, is itself a distortion of genuine faith, not its essence.
So true faith isn't about having all the answers.
Not according to this perspective. The essence of faith is reframed. It's not defined as clinging intellectually to a set of proven facts or guaranteed outcomes.
What is it then?
It's defined more as trusting God in the fog of uncertainty.
Trusting in the fog. That resonates with the student's desire for reality, for imperfection.
It does. It validates that need, arguing that embracing uncertainty isn't anti-faith. It's actually compatible with, or maybe even required for, authentic faith.
Are there biblical examples to back this up? The sources mention some.
Absolutely. And these figures are held up as heroes of faith, yet they were models of navigating profound uncertainty, not avoiding it. Think of Abraham. When God called him, the text says he set out not knowing where he was going.
Right. That's not just like missing a map. That's total existential ambiguity.
It's profound. He's acting solely on a promise, stepping into a complete unknown. That requires immense struggle, immense trust, not certainty about the destination.
And Moses.
Moses at the Red Sea, the Egyptian army closing in behind, the raging sea ahead. That is a moment of pure, terrifying uncertainty. There is no easy answer presented, no clear plan revealed in that instant, just crisis and the need to act in faith.
Not exactly a comforting prepackaged solution.
Not at all. And then there's the ultimate example, Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane.
His prayer before his crucifixion.
Yes. It's the absolute antithesis of cheap comfort or easy certainty. His prayer is filled with human anguish, with dread, possibly even doubt about the necessity of the path ahead. Not my will, but yours be done.
That act of wrestling, of surrendering his own will to a painful, unknown future,
Is the polar opposite of having a tidy, prepackaged answer that dissolves life's difficulty. It embraces the difficulty within the trust.
This connects to that philosophical point the source made, citing Kierkegaard.
Right, Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher of existentialism and faith.
What was his insight relevant here?
Kierkegaard argued passionately that the true enemy of genuine faith isn't doubt. Doubt for him was almost necessary. It requires engagement, passion, wrestling.
So what is the enemy?
False certainty. The comfortable, lazy assumption that you've got it all figured out, that faith is just adhering to a set of doctrines without personal struggle or risk.
Ah, I see. Because false certainty removes the need for that act of trust, that leap.
Exactly. It removes the requirement for intellectual struggle, for passionate commitment, for genuine, risky engagement with the divine and with life's ambiguity. If you think you're absolutely certain, your faith can become just intellectual assent to historical facts or doctrines. It lacks vitality.
But if you're willing to live in the fog, to embrace the uncertainty,
Then you must commit yourself actively, passionately, personally, day by day. The struggle itself, the trusting despite the lack of clear answers, becomes the very act of faith.
So this theological response cleverly turns the student's critique back on itself.
In a way, yes. It argues that genuine faith actually requires the acceptance of pain, confusion, anxiety, the very elements of real imperfection that the student was craving. Faith isn't an escape from that reality. It's a way of navigating within it.
Okay, this is starting to form a coherent counter-narrative, so let's get practical. For that young seeker, the student, who feels the pull of the community's warmth, but also the constraint of those gentle ropes, who genuinely desires freedom of thought, how does this theological framework offer concrete guidance? How do they live this out?
The guidance presented in the source material aims to reclaim the spiritual experience from that potentially transactional model they observed. It offers a different way.
What's the first step?
First, don't suppress the doubts. Turn them into dialogue, into prayer. Those legitimate questions about conditional love, about certainty, about the community's methods, they shouldn't be seen as barriers, as walls separating you from faith.
See them as
Doors leading deeper into relationship with God, into understanding. The source quotes Psalm 61, "From the ends of the earth I call to you when my heart grows faint." The struggle, the calling out from doubt, becomes the connection point.
Okay, embrace the questions, don't run from them. What else?
Second, shift the focus for experiencing grace. Move it away from community performance and towards the ordinary.
What does that mean, community performance?
Well, the feeling observed in the town was perhaps that you have to perform piety. Attend every meeting, say the right things, conform to the group norms to really belong or feel God's love. Striving to be the perfect believer.
Right, keeping up appearances within the web.
Exactly. The guidance suggests correcting that. Discover God's love not in achieving that perfect image, but in simple, selfless acts of service flowing outwards.
Like what?
Like teaching children, visiting someone lonely, helping a neighbor with a practical task. Small things done out of love.
How does that change the dynamic?
It redirects the energy. It's no longer about earning spiritual points, which feeds into that transactional anxiety the student felt. Instead, it's about acting out of the grace you believe you've already received freely. The source links this to 1 John 4.19. We love because he first loved us.
So the loving action flows from the gift, not towards earning it.
Precisely. That breaks the cycle of trying to perform for acceptance, either from God or the community. It liberates the seeker from that pressure.
Okay, embrace questions, find grace in ordinary service.
Yeah.
What's the third piece of guidance?
It's about embracing that imperfect reality within faith, not seeing faith as an escape from it.
Back to the infinitely real-life idea.
Yes. The source explicitly reminds the seeker that faith doesn't magically erase suffering or confusion. It points to biblical examples.
Like Job.
Job's anguished cries, Jesus weeping at Lazarus' tomb. Suffering is real, confusion happens, grief is valid. Faith doesn't deny that.
But it offers.
It reveals God's presence within the suffering, within the confusion, not necessarily explaining it away, but promising presence and ultimate redemption through it. It validates the real imperfection the observer sought, but integrates it into a spiritual framework that doesn't demand the sacrifice of intellectual honesty or emotional reality.
So, in essence, the theological response takes the student's core demands for freedom, for authenticity, for embracing uncertainty, and argues they are contradictory to deep faith.
Not only not contradictory, but perhaps even prerequisites for a faith that is truly genuine, profound, non-transactional, and ultimately liberating. Hashtag tag tag outro, synthesis and provocation.
All right, so reflecting on this whole deep dive, what does it all really mean? Where does it leave us?
Well, we started with that really detailed critical observation, didn't we? Those 5 churches, the twin vines, the gentle embrace.
And that powerful critique.
Yeah.
The idea that this system, however well-intentioned, might be trading worldly warmth and community for the surrender of freedom of thought. A gentle snare.
Yeah, a critique rooted in a deep desire for authenticity and intellectual honesty. And then we balanced that. We explored a robust theological defense.
One that argues forcefully that true divine grace is fundamentally unconditional, not an exchange.
And that true faith isn't about finding cheap certainty, but demands something much harder, much more real, exercising profound trust right in the middle of genuine uncertainty and doubt, trusting in the fog.
So the journey really forces us, and you the listener, to navigate this tricky space between a system that can feel like a gentle snare.
And the possibility of a faith that embraces openness, intellectual struggle, and spiritual trust simultaneously.
The sources leave us with one final, really powerful image to try and hold these tensions together.
Yes, the final metaphor. It suggests that authentic Christian faith, when properly understood, maybe isn't a gentle snare at all, nor is it some kind of, sugar-coated escape from life's difficulties. Instead, it's perhaps best understood as a rose with thorns.
A rose with thorns. Yeah.
It implies beauty, life, vitality, the bloom. But it also acknowledges the piercing reality, the thorns. It suggests that commitment, real faith, might involve pain, wrestling, critical thought, deep engagement. It isn't always comfortable.
But it still blooms.
It still blooms with life, beauty, and points towards something eternal. It acknowledges the cost of commitment, but insists on the value of the life it offers.
That's a much more complex picture than the simple snare.
Much more. And it leads to this final, provocative thought. A practical challenge, really, for the listener.
Especially for those maybe feeling that pull, that tension we've been discussing. Young seekers navigating these intense faith communities.
Exactly. If those church bells do call to you, if you do receive that invitation to dinner, that offer of kindness, the advice derived from this whole exploration is pretty clear.
What is it?
Go. Accept the invitation. Engage with the community. But go with your questions.
Don't leave your critical thinking at the door.
Absolutely not, because faith, understood in this deeper, more challenging way, isn't about finding one final, easy answer that just dissolves all the complexity. It's about the active encounter, encountering the one who claims to be the way, the truth, and the life. It's a relational journey, not just an intellectual puzzle to be solved.
And that freedom, that unconditional love that the seeker's looking for.
They aren't contradictions you have to choose between, like the town's system might implicitly suggest. According to this theological view, they are gifts. Gifts that flow from the same source of grace.
And they're discovered how?
Discovered precisely in the struggle, in the doubt, in the questions, and ultimately in the commitment to living that imperfect but infinitely real life, perhaps within a faith that makes space for it all.
Go and wrestle.
That's the
That is the deep dive.